quite sure what will be possible today, but I would like to introduce the fourth exercise, which could be, as I'll explain when I get to it, could be seen as two exercises. I'd like to introduce that, maybe the fifth one. But before even introducing the fourth, I just thought I'd spend a little time opening up and considering some of the words and the vocabulary we've been using. By now it's quite familiar to a lot of you who are familiar with soulmaking dharma teachings. Some of these words and some of these terms, particularly as they inform and inflect and open up our sense of human being and our human person and personhood and what it is to be a person. So just want to say a few things about that. A few weeks ago, not very long ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was trying to remember the actual details, and I can't remember exactly what it was that I was feeling really quite pressured about, and I'm going to say thrown off centre, unbalanced, pressured, flattened. But there were a lot of things that seemed like they needed deciding at the time. Practical things in relation to preparing for death and my will and future of the teachings and teacher training and all kinds of things. A lot of things that seemed to need figuring out and arranging before my death. Excuse me. And within that there were, it seemed, lots of different people's requests and opinions and voices in there, and yes, can't remember exactly what it is, but it was to do with those kinds of things, and particularly in relation to the teachings and the future of the teachings and teachers and things like that. But at some point I realized that I'm really not feeling okay with all this. It's all gotten a bit crazy. And the language that came to me, or the language that seemed very natural at that point, to describe what was missing for myself at that point, and that language also very insightful, but it came very naturally. It was not the language of "I've lost my center," as I said a minute ago, or whatever, or "I'm uncentered," or "I need to get centered, I need to regain my center or center myself," or whatever. That wasn't the language that came. And I would understand, of course, those kinds of situations and that kind of feeling flustered and pulled in so many directions and so many decisions and all that would very easily be a way that we in our contemporary society might describe to ourselves what has happened and then what needs to happen. But the words that came, the description that came organically, naturally, spontaneously, and that contained, of course, the insight, the seeds of insight for what I needed to do to redress the situation, was that I've lost my connection with the angels. I lost my connection with the daemon. And I need to somehow reconnect, find that connection again with the angel, with the daemon, with the image. And that, as I said, the insight was there. In the description of the problem was the insight of the direction needed for a solution, where I needed to orient, what I needed to do, how I needed to look, how I needed to relate and think about things. And that was exactly what did indeed help. Finding again these connections with the angels in relation to all that was difficult and the sort of what was at the middle, or the pith of the difficulty in relation to the teachings, basically, because it was all seemed most of it centered around the teachings and the future of the teachings and all that stuff. And so finding my connection again, finding again my connection with the angels in my relationship with them in relation to the teachings. So all of that. And that's what had got lost. And I was trying to figure out, solve, find answers to get through a lot of decisions and things that needed to be made. And it all felt quite pressured, but I had lost that connection. I'd gone into a much more one-dimensional mode of understanding that and relating to all that set of issues and decisions and problems and conundra. It was all one-dimensional. It was not, the angel wasn't there. I wasn't in relationship with the angel, with all of that. So when a person today, uses language like need to lost my center, need to get centered, or centered myself, or find my center, regain my center, what does that word kind of tend to imply, or what's wrapped up in that kind of notion and that kind of vocabulary? And particularly what's wrapped up, what does it tend to imply about the human being and about the self and about the person? What's the logos, the conceptual framework of human being, self, person, that is kind of implicitly tied in with a notion such as centering? So there's probably quite a few, and it's not set in stone, and it may vary, etc. But you could think about a few of them. For instance, interiority is one of them. Generally, not necessarily, but generally, the center of gravity, my center of gravity, and therefore my sense of balance, my point of balance, is conceived then usually within, somehow within me. So here one's feeling perhaps pulled out, so to speak, to all these diverse distractions or pulls or demands or questions or whatever it is, needs. And the center of gravity, the still point, the balance point, is conceived of as within, usually. So there's a kind of interiority there that's part of the conceptual framework of the human being that goes with words like centering and notions like centering. Perhaps. Secondly, also, is perhaps a notion of circumscription of the human being, of the self. Like, where do I end? I end here, the world starts there, or you start there, or whatever it is. So when we talk about a center, we talk about a center of something. Usually it's a center of a circle, or a center of a geometrical structure, or whatever it is. Center of a limited space, a limited area. Center of a country, whatever. So there's a delimited space, a circumscribed space, where I end. That's my boundary, if you like. That's my border. That notion also seems wrapped up kind of subtly, implicitly, with the notion of centering. Now, I could still have a kind of circumscribed notion of where I end. That could still be involved if, when I use the language and idea of connection with the daemon, connection with the angel. But what I meant and what I mean by that, what I would like to emphasize right now by that connection with the angels is, and refinding that connection with the angel, or angels, is more a kind of expanded notion or sense of a human being. As we talked about, I think it was in the talk on death and dying in Psyche's Orchard. Rather than this area is me. We have a sense of the larger human being is both image and analog. Okay, so there's a couple of parts to that. The first part has to do with circumscription, the second part has to do with singularity. But just stay with circumscription. Image and analog, and I in my life am, to the best of my ability, or more or less at different times, the analog of that image, of the angel. And where then do I end? If I have this more expanded notion of self, I am actually this whole system is too technical a word, but this whole gestalt, this whole constellation of image and analog, or maybe images and analogs, and that's all me, then where do I end in that? Where is my circumscription in that exactly? And anyway then, the image, because the elements of the imaginal, the angel, the image, where does the image end? Because that's going to be unfathomable and have unfathomable beyonds, etc. Where do I draw the line then of self there? Of my human being? And so where then exactly is the center of it? If I can't draw the line of the edge of the circle or whatever, I don't know where to place the center. I cannot say the center is here or there. So that's another aspect: interiority, circumscription, but also, as I mentioned, singularity. Sometimes, usually, with this notion of centering, I mean, a sense of the singularity of self. I need to find my center. I, as a singular self, need to kind of have recourse to myself, find the resource find my resource in myself, in my center. And the sense then is the self as singular. Now, a person in contemporary society, of course, could say, I feel terrible, I feel really pressured, I reach out to friends and colleagues or whatever it is, and reaching out horizontally to, socially, horizontally, to the horizontal sense of society and friends, etc. But one could also reach out more plurally, if you like, not so much just to the singular self, not only reaching out horizontally to the flatly conceived society of others in which I exist, but rather conceiving of the self as a plurality. So this, just the fact of conceiving of the human being, conceiving of the human person, as described and tried to really emphasize in that talk on death and dying, conceiving of the human person actually phenomenologically, and when we have a deep sense both of ourselves and of another, and when another has a deep sense of ourselves, that the experience is not necessarily completely singular. And I don't mean it's fragmented in the way sometimes anatta gets taught, but I mean it's plural, or rather not simply singular, in the way that we are both image and analog, or images and analogues. Several angels perhaps, and servant to analog to that plurality even of angels. So quite different notions there. Interiority, circumscription and borders, and singularity are not the sort of the default mode of sense of the human being, the human person. And they weren't in that case, and as I find more and more these days when things are difficult, when there's challenge, different ways, that the sense, and I mean that word in its double meaning, the sense, the actual perception and the idea of my human being or another human being is not so much, is more along the lines of this image and analog, of having angelic dimensions which are refracted into the human life more or less at different times with a duty to that. There's a kind of doubleness there, if you like. So, it's also not, of course, when we think about centering, that word centering, take a fourth aspect or fourth notion that might be wrapped up in it, or idea that might be wrapped up in centering, is that one then encounters one's self, or one's true self, or one's core, if you like, or whatever, at the center. Introspecting, one then finds oneself at the center. And, sort of, maybe not Dharma 101, but pretty soon in the Dharma you're going to encounter the idea, and it's not just particular to Buddha Dharma. So when I look for the self, I can't find it, actually. So we're not talking then, one could think about centering as, I need to center because I need to encounter that self at my center. Or it could be that what I'm expecting at the center is a kind of infinite depth of still nothingness, of stillness and nothingness, which is a wonderful sense. One can look inside and there's different kinds of nothingness, different kinds of stillness, but that kind of infinite depth of stillness and nothingness is what one maybe encounters at the center. We talk about in the Christian tradition in the 20th century there was a re-stimulation, a revivification of some of their contemplative practices in the Catholic tradition, centering prayer. And originally, I think it's changed now, but originally it meant just that. In the center is this still nothingness, beyond any image of God, beyond any word or directive, or is just a kind of emptiness. And so this is tied up also with the via negativa, the apophatic tradition. Looking deep inside myself, I encounter nothing, and that nothingness is the same, the depth of that nothingness is the same as the depth of the nothingness of God. So this is wonderful, and this is a real mystical resource, but still meaning something quite different. If I wasn't gravitating towards that notion and that movement of centering and of needing centering, it's not that I'm expecting to encounter myself at the center, nor am I expecting, nor am I kind of hoping for an experience of still nothingness at the center, which may, of course, be very helpful at different times. But rather, you need to reconnect with the angels. And the angel, the image, is other and itself. It's both and neither. It's me and not me, and it's not me and not me. This angel, in the mystery of their being, in the mystery of this angelic constellation, this angelic relationship, this angel is both other and self. But it's theophany. It's a face of the divine. It's an expression of the divine, which is different than an emptiness. An emptiness is not a theophany. An emptiness is taken usually construed as an essence, and this is a usually construed as a transcendent essence beyond all attributes. A theophany is a face, a presentation of, we could say, of attributes, or is a being in itself, a person in itself, you could say. So rather than encountering myself at the center, rather than encountering a deep well of still nothingness, wonderful as that might be, actually, not at the center, but in relationship with a theophany. Not at the center of anything, but in relationship with. Where exactly is that in space? So, quite different notions, and some of this will be to different degrees familiar if you're familiar with soulmaking dharma. Some of the ways we use these words, and some of really what I'm wanting to point to is where the words point to, the direction of possibility in which these words and these terms point, as opposed to they themselves define this or that, and this is the circumscription, this is the limit and definition, delimitation of these words. More to get a sense of this is the words are directions. The directions of soul possibility, directions of soul experience and soul conception. And we linger on this word angel a little bit. We've used it quite a lot over the last years. But just to say a few more things about it. Careful, for instance, of a limiting idea that the angel or an image kind of shows up out of the blue and will help you with something, or give you an idea, or give you a creative impulse, or whatever it is, a seed or something. It might show up out of the blue, and we talked about, and again I can't remember when, but we talked about, I used the phrase, the poise of soul-making, or something like that. Soul-making poise. In other words, taking care of the stance, the poise of one's being, one's energy body, one's attention, one's receptivity, one's humility, and all of that. And in that poise, in the soul-making poise, it's a sort of opening the space, priming and preparing the space. Thinking now parallels with the Jewish tradition of preparing for the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is the reception of the Shekhinah, the reception of the Sabbath angel who visits, who comes on that evening, on that day. And the human being's job is partly to prepare, to make the space and make the space and the time beautiful, ready, prepared, holy, special, hospitable. So it may well be that we with an attitude of humility, we learn to take care with that soul-making poise, and in that way we are in a kind of humbly waiting and primed or prepared space. Our being becomes that space, becomes a space of hospitality for the angels, and they may visit then sort of out of the blue, and then with that there may be a gift. We may be helped with this or that in our lives, given something, given an idea, given, as I said, creative seeds, whatever. But careful of that as an idea that might limit our sense of angels and what they are and how they arise and what our relationship with them is. Because it's often the case, and this is something I've shared before, it's often the case that one has already started something. Perhaps it's a creative project or a big piece of work, an idea, and perhaps it feels like a lot. It feels like a stretch or a challenge. And the angel comes then. And the coming of the angel might be the work itself, or this project itself, becoming imaginal. It becomes angelic. So it might be there's me, and there's this project, and then there's this third character called the angel that's going to help me in my relationship with the project. But it might also be that the work itself, or the idea that's beginning to take shape, that I'm grappling with, that I'm kind of gestating, or is wanting to come through, whatever it is, or this big project that I need to do, whatever that might be, that it becomes angel. It becomes angelic. It becomes imaginal person with autonomy, with desire, its own eros, its own desire, etc. So careful of, again, not delimiting too tightly what we mean by angel. So we have to delimit it in some. We're not just open for any old ideas about angels and all that business. So I said the words, the concepts are pointing us in a direction, pointing us along a road, but that road is infinite. It has boundaries. It's not like anything can fall under the scope of that road, and we can just call anything angel, which is, in some circles fairly common. Just use that word too easily, whether it's used completely unspiritually, just as a kind of term of endearment, or in certain spiritual New Age circles or whatever. And we're not using it in those ways. So maybe that's a good analogy. It's like we're pointing in a certain direction, and one can just keep traveling in that direction. And the road changes. The road develops. The terrain around the road develops as you walk down that road. But another way of saying this is an angel is also, like everything, a dependent arising. So what I was just talking about, it's almost like or we could say in the first instance, it's dependent on the poise of soul-making. The visitation of the Shekhinah on Shabbat is dependent on the reverence and humility and the eros of the soul and the love of the soul for the Shekhinah and for the divine, and expressing that by the way it takes care of creating the space for the Sabbath. In terms of the body and house and setting and environment. So of course all this applies in so many ways to soul-making and imaginal work and ritual and all that. But it's dependent arising, an angel is dependent arising also in possibly another sense, which is, as I said, something is already there, it's already stretching me. And then the angel visits in response to that stretch, in response to that task that I'm given, in response to that work that I have to do. And it might be that one possibility within that is that the work itself, the task itself, becomes angel. It becomes imaginal, angelic. So I've touched on this before, actually quite a few times. This question, some people say, I don't get any images, or I don't get images, and sometimes people are okay with that, but sometimes it's like people get a little bit frustrated, or why don't I get images? Or they might say, if they use slightly different language, having heard other language being used, they might say, why don't the angels seem to come to me? Why don't they seem to come to other people? Or I hear this person or that person talk about the angels coming, or the angel coming, or whatever. Why don't they seem to come to me? Or it might be voiced as, it might be, the angels, the gods, they don't seem to want anything from me. I hear this person or that person talk, and I hear them talk about the demand of the angel, the demand of the imaginal, or the duty, or this or that. But they don't seem to come to me, or they don't seem to want anything from me. So this whole constellation of ideas and perceptions and things that people might think, I've talked about quite a lot over the years. Why don't I get image, and what do we actually mean by image, and what are the kind of, again, preparations, poises of soul, but also relationships with one's emotions and energy body, and all kinds of other factors that support the generation, the arising, the creation, discovery of images, angels, etc. So there's lots of reasons which I've elaborated elsewhere. One I've touched on, just want to touch on again, and that actually has to do with desire and need, to maybe two aspects. So sometimes I say, why don't I get images? I don't know. Other reasons that I've elaborated elsewhere aside. So there may well be, actually for many people, this isn't a relevant reason, what I'm about to say. Maybe there's just other things they're not relating in the right way to their emotions or whatever it is. But sometimes it's like, actually, if you really, really deeply wanted images, they would come. You would have images. Images would visit you. They would arise if you really deeply wanted them. So sometimes, for some people, the issue is one of desire. And a person goes, oh, why don't I get images? Or they seem to get more, this person seems to get more than I do, or whatever. But it may be that actually it's not something we really deeply want. And so they don't necessarily arise. So maybe, as is sometimes for some people, that actually is the relevant factor. And maybe they're related, it might be that for some people at some time, again, this is not going to be relevant to some people, or in some instances it won't be relevant, but it may be, why don't the angels seem to come to me? Why don't the gods, the angels, seem to want anything from me? It may be that you and I and the imaginal figures, the angels, don't need each other. They actually don't need each other. They don't need me and I don't need them. They don't need you and you don't need them. Because there's nothing in the way a person is living and the choices that a person is making that needs the help or presence of the angels, of the imaginal figures. There's nothing really on the line, so to speak. There isn't really a soul stretch. We touched on this before, if you remember, I can't remember where. There isn't really, they're not living and choosing in their life in ways that really stretch their soul or that open them to kind of soul risks, if we might use that phrase. There's nothing really on the line. And they might be stretched in all kinds of ways, might be very busy, might be stretched doing, really something very helpful in the world, whatever. But it's not actually a soul stretch. And there's no real risk there. And maybe it's that the angels, the imaginal figures, the daemons, don't need and won't choose someone who is not willing to stretch themselves, stretch their lives, stretch their soul. So this is also a factor to consider. As I said, it won't be relevant in a lot of instances, but sometimes it is important to realize this is actually what's happening. Well, this is a reason why something is not happening. It may also be that and again, this will be even in only perhaps some instances of the instances that I've just talked about where that is the case. It may be that the kind of stretch needed to invite or call forth the angel, the angels, the kind of stretch to which they respond, maybe it needs to be one which involves or must involve a sense of antinomy. Remember that word from the ethics talks, from Sila and Soul and the image of ethics. Antinomy is deeply felt in the soul. And having to choose, faced with that antinomy, the branches, the roads of their divergent pulls and callings, felt sharply, deeply, genuinely in the soul. One is almost crucified, pulled this way and that, by two opposing values, by the love of and the duty of, duty to antinomical values. And it may be that kind of stretch, that kind of difficulty is the kind of stretch that sometimes, or maybe I don't know, maybe it's in every case needed. That's part of what it means to be stretched. Maybe that's a certain kind of stretch, I'm not sure. So all these are things to, I think, ponder. And of course, some people, like I said, going back to something I said earlier, well, it might not bother me that much, that this sense of angels that I hear people talking about, or images, don't come to me. And if it doesn't, okay, leave it. But if it actually does, then these are things that you might want to include in your kind of inquiry and self-questioning. And just briefly, I heard sort of someone was saying something about soul-making dharma, and basically the upshot was, or one of the pieces was, well, I'm sure it's all really great, but I'm very much paraphrasing, but I don't really relate to the word soul. And this was from a person who'd been practicing dharma and a long time, actually a teacher, long, decades and decades, which is, probably quite a common reaction, I imagine, not really relating to that word soul at all. Oftentimes, it's the making that people don't relate to. The word making, of course, if you understand the whole track of exploration of ways of looking and fabrication is just another word for making, and how that deepens and how it opens out and the understanding it opens out, then the word making is almost an indispensable word in soul making. But for a lot of people it's very puzzling, because you'd usually think of the word soul, or have a sense of soul, use that in a very rarefied way. So it wouldn't be something that we make, it would be something that is, or we discover, or that just is a level of being, or whatever. Anyway, this person, it was the word soul, and I thought about that and know them a little bit, and said, well, it's interesting. Do you really relate? You've been involved in Buddhism for 30, 40 years, whatever it is. Do you really relate to the word aggregate? Skanda in Sanskrit. Or put the question in the past tense, did you really relate to that word when you first heard it? Or or the words emptiness or anatta, no self, those kinds of words and concepts? Probably not. But what's happened, it might be sometimes with words like emptiness seem to have sort of predisposition that many Dharma folk have to that kind of an intuition, if you like, of that insight and that whole direction and that whole teaching, even before you even encountered the teaching. But the word like aggregate, it's hard to think that one would really relate to that immediately when one hears it. Might be, but probably not. What was probably happened instead is one has been trained and trained oneself to use words like aggregate as skillful and helpful concepts, and then perhaps even as ways of looking. One has been trained in the use of a word like aggregate or a concept like aggregate, as trained to use them and think of them in skillful and helpful ways. And they're not ultimate truths. This is something I've said many times. 5 aggregates is not at all an obvious way of kind of dividing up a human being. And it's hardly, I would suspect, a kind of a way of thinking about self that one would have arrived at by oneself if one wasn't actually handed this teaching, 5 aggregates, and this is what they are. And it was handed to us by someone in a position of authority, with the authority of 2,500 years of Buddhist tradition, and then we trained ourselves in those words. So just the fact that one doesn't really relate to a word that one is not familiar with in itself means nothing much at all. Couldn't the word soul be similarly unfamiliar at first, but eventually, with practice and understanding, actually become, like the word aggregate, very fruitful, like the concept aggregate? And in fact, even be the word soul, the concept soul, be something that contributes and supports to the reduction of particular sorts of suffering, just as the way aggregates does. That's the function of the word aggregate. As I say, it's not an ultimate truth. What the teachings of the aggregates do, or are supposed to do, or designed to do, is just that. They're just a group of concepts in the service of reducing suffering. It's not an ultimate truth. And couldn't soul be just something similar? Unfamiliar at first, but with training, with practice, as understanding grows, it becomes very fruitful as a term of vocabulary and a concept, and fruitful in many ways, but in one particular way, in reducing certain kinds of suffering. So the word, for example, the word aggregate will not, on its own, authentically and finally reduce the suffering of soullessness, for example. So again, if we open up, what does that first noble truth mean? What kinds of suffering are there? And therefore, what does the third noble truth mean? Ending suffering. We could say these days there is the suffering of soullessness in our society, in our culture. Suffering, and part of that is a suffering of meaninglessness. And we could bag it all together as the suffering of soullessness. It's also to do with lack of beauty and aesthetics, and lack of depth, lack of refusal of dimensionality, all kinds of things. But the word aggregate on its own will not finally, fully and authentically reduce the suffering reduce that kind of suffering of the suffering of soullessness. In fact, it might even support it. The suffering of soullessness may be worsened by the teachings on the aggregates if I'm not careful how I pick them up, and if or when I put them down. So, I mean, we could choose other words as well, even words like words from our contemporary culture, not from Buddhist culture, like trauma. It's an idea, And actually it's a whole conceptual framework. So nowadays when we speak psychologically and we draw on that word and we use that term, we're actually invoking and implying a whole conceptual framework of psychology there. Yes, I don't really relate to that. In other times, other cultures, other periods of history, it would have been a quite bizarre notion, or even just the sort of broader notion of, say, for instance, early or parenting experiences shape the psychology, or are a dominant factor. Let's put a dominant factor in the shaping of later psychology. Again, there's a whole conceptual framework. Actually, there's many conceptual frameworks, many alternate conceptual frameworks which overlap that we're invoking when we even say words that point to that whole idea and that whole framework of ideas. So it could be really, really helpful, but may not relate to it at first. Maybe very, very useful, these words borrowed from psychology and these psychological concepts and notions. Or even when we use the word brain, I mean, certainly in the Buddha's time they were aware there was an organ in the middle of the head that was, they had their word for it. I've forgotten what the Pali is. They had looked at corpses and dissected them or whatever. But the way we use the word brain now, or the way many people in our culture use the word brain now as synonymous with mind, might not be, or definitely was not at all, how the Buddha meant the word brain or mind, as being something that was necessarily primarily physical even, or certainly not completely physical. So there's lots of words and concepts. So at this time in history, in culture, or at this time in my evolution and my practice and my journey, I don't really relate to this word soul. So what? It doesn't mean that it cannot then become, with training, a very useful, very fruitful, very freeing idea, word, term, a vocabulary and concept. Back to that word aggregates, if it's, even if it's just picked up as a kind of notion without much skill in using it as a way of looking in terms of anatta, etc., as I would kind of outline that direction of practice, the anatta practice, it still functions to fabricate less. As a term of vocabulary, it fabricates less suffering, it certainly fabricates less self-sense. It dissects and kind of undercuts self-construction, self-fabrication. Okay, so it might do that at all different levels, let's say, depending on how much skill one has in actually practicing with that notion. But as a term, it's what it does is it moves in the direction, it stimulates the direction of less fabrication, of suffering and of self, or of some sufferings and of some levels of self, let's say. But in so doing just that, in its movement towards fabricating less self, it at the same time, the other side of the coin is that therefore it doesn't honor and respect and keep in focus or keep in sense the person. And the person as someone in relationship, in meaningful relationship. That gets lost. The minute we start emphasizing talk of the aggregates and a view of the aggregates, then we simultaneously lose sense of the richness and multidimensionality of personhood and the relationality of personhood. Again, I'm going back to that talk. Pretty sure it was one on death and dying. Sort of thinking, what could we use this word person to mean, perhaps, when we're talking about a human subject, a human being that's more than subject because they're in meaningful relationship. And so they're more than just self, they're more than just, they become a person. If we really want to honor and respect and keep in our sense, in our senses, and keep making sense of the personhood of a person. So they're kind of divergent directions or modes. The notion of the aggregates or the notion of, let's say, soul. Later on in Vajrayana teachings, there's the possibility of seeing the aggregates, the 5 aggregates, as divine, as holy. But even then, we actually lose the personhood of the person. It dimensionalizes in a different way. Each aggregate, depending on different tantras, each aggregate is associated with a different divinity, a different Buddha, or Buddha's consort, or Dakini, or whatever. So there's a wonderful kind of dimensionalizing and divinizing that can come through that, but it still misses the person. Beautiful range of practices there. It still misses the person. So the term aggregates and the term soul almost do almost mutually exclusive opposite instigate mutually exclusive opposite movements. Almost. So talk about soul, talk about angels, talk about all this, but in dyadic practice, in soul-making practice, and even in some of these exercises, all this that we're pointing to now when we talk about these different words and all the different shades and meanings and scopes and dimensions of what these words mean, and what they point away from and where they point towards and what they open up, all this kind of emerges naturally, I would say, through the process of sensing with soul. And you probably experienced if you've done dyad practice, and at certain points, who am I in relationship to here? Who is this other, or a triad, or who are these others? And sometimes when we've been leading that on a retreat, you'll hear on the recording, sometimes we stimulate a shift in the sense towards sensing with soul, towards sensing the other as angel, others as angels, just by asking the question, when there is soulfulness, when there's soulfulness in the field, and then asking that question, who are these others? Who is this now that I'm beholding? But just asking the question in a field of soulfulness can stimulate a further opening of the sensing with soul. We begin to perceive other as angel. Other times we might deliberately suggest, can you see them now as angels? Or did we just start speaking of these others as angels? Or a person makes that deliberate shift in their sensing and like deliberately calling up an image, deliberately deciding to sense, see other as angel. But all these words, angel, soul, image, they imply an unfathomability. They also imply, going back to something I said earlier today, that a kind of neither a simple singularity nor a simple doubleness. So this, if I'm seeing this person as angel, I'm seeing them as neither simply single nor double. They are usual Tom, Dick or Harry, and Tom, Dick or Harry's angel or whatever. There's a mystery in the kind of impossibility of finally dividing them up as one or two. This being that I'm encountering, this being that I'm sensing with soul. But all these words, when we use words like angel or soul or my soul, or anytime we talk about image, there's that unfathomability there. And there's this neither one nor two, really simply. As well as implied in the words angel, soul, image, etc. The dimensionality, the divinity, the infinite echoing and mirroring. So that's, infinite echoing and mirroring is of the angel into this person's life. And this person's life and this person's being as the infinite echoing and mirroring of the angel. And the angel also a mirror and an echo of the being in a kind of two-way back and forth, echoing and mirroring each other. The mystery of that kind of sense and notion is also wrapped up in the sense of angel and soul, as of course is also the imaginal middle way, neither real nor not real, the theatre-like quality. So when we use these words, angel, soul, just like image, all this is wrapped up there. And also eternality. So the angelic dimension is the timeless dimension. Perceive this person as angel, perceive an angel without a just an image, or the angel that I'm in relationship to, or the soul, etc. This implied is eternality. And so the angel, as we said again, I think in that talk on death and dying, I think it was that one, angel is not of space or time. The being of the angel, the dimension of the being of the angel, is not of space. It's not located inside me or next to me or behind me or wherever, above me, below me. But nor is it located in time. It's refracted, this angel, he, she, they are refracted into space and time. And there's a sense too of participation. The angel is something, we talk again, going back to examples, okay, we need to reconnect with the angels. There's also a sense of re-participating in something, or reconnecting with my sense of participating in something, and the mystery of that word. So when we use these words, all these other words are, all these other notions are kind of woven in to the meaning of these words. They become very rich words. Soul, angel, just like image. And again, similar to the analogy I said about these words are like roads. They point in a certain direction, but that road goes on forever. And that's another way of saying all these words and concepts and perceptions, especially like soul and angel, they have soft and elastic edges. Actually, all those words like participation and divinity and eternality and all of them, soft and elastic edges. And they will stretch. So our notion of what we're talking about when we say soul and angel, that will stretch over time, it will deepen, it will be deepened, it will be complexified, it will be variegated. As the sensing of soul is encouraged, as soul-making goes on, as the soul-making dynamic is allowed to do what it wants to do. Soft and elastic edges, they will stretch, they will deepen, complexify, and variegate. Okay, so let's introduce, let's call it the fourth exercise. We might consider it two exercises, so the fourth and the fifth, or set of exercises, I don't know. And this one is in fact a dyad exercise. All these two are dyad exercises. And so I'll try and describe. And the first, if we take it as two exercises, the first one, the first part, if you say, let's two exercises, two parts, of one exercise in two parts. The first part, in a dyad, and setting that up, whatever it needs to set that up, in terms of the temenos, in terms of the space, in terms of the presence. And in the first part, really, one person in the dyad blesses the other, and the other person receives the other's blessing. So one is blessing and one is receiving. Now we've done quite a bit of this in different ways in the past, but just want to add a few more pieces in there, a few more variations as well. So some of it will be familiar, and some will be maybe less so. So one person is it's their turn, and they bless the other, and they bless them through movement, gesture, and voice. So, but what you cannot do as the blesser is you cannot use any known language, any language known to human beings. So you can utter sounds, you can use your voice, but not any known language. Somehow you're conveying blessing and emanating blessing, expressing and manifesting blessing. So, one thing here is, what does that mean, that word blessing? And again, back to what we just said about these words, soft and elastic edges, and it will grow and it will deepen. The meaning of the word blessing may already be very wide, but if it may, or it may not, it may start out, well, I'm not even sure what it means exactly. But it is potentially wide, deep, and multi-dimensional, and open and elastic, soft and elastic. So that we, as we practice more sensing the soul, and especially in relation to blessing and being blessed, we can hopefully create and discover more and more of what blessing might mean. So it might start, for instance, as just metta. I'm not really sure about that word blessing, but I know what metta means, and I'm familiar with that. So it might just start as that. Okay, let it start as that. Maybe it includes praise, what they call doxology is the fancy word. Words of praise, doxology, or in this case movements, gestures, and vocalizations of praise. So maybe that's a slight expansion from just the notion of metta. Start expanding. Maybe it includes that. Maybe it includes also gratitude, that in one's praise there's gratitude wrapped up in it. Remember, again, I can't remember what talk it was from, but that word Eucharist actually means thankfulness, or gratitude, I think, in Greek. But it may be that as we either within this exercise, or as we repeat the exercise, or as we generally just do more soul-making practice, and our sense of soulfulness grows, and the range of experience and ideation grows, it may be that this whole notion grows of what it means to bless and what it means to be blessed. And in the exercise, it might be that as we're doing the exercise, the self, the sense of the self, the sense of the other, and the sense of the world, the environment, maybe even time or whatever, all that can become image. Maybe if I'm trying to, use my voice without language, and trying to bless but without language, and it might be that the sounds, the words, or maybe they're not even words, but the sounds uttered and heard become image. They become imaginal. And who is blessing? And who is blessed? All this becomes image, and in so doing it becomes imaginal image. Its meaning expands and deepens. It may be that there's well, we can come back to that. So, just in terms of the exercise, then maybe you're in a dyad. You're facing each other. One person takes the first turn to be the blesser. The job of the other is the one who is blessed, and their job, their task is twofold. But really has to do with just silent sensitivity and receptivity. And they want to notice they're looking at and listening to and opening their whole energy body. We've done all this kind of thing before. To open the whole energy body and all the senses open to the other and their blessing and their movement and voice and gesture. Open to the sound and the visuals and all the senses, the whole energy body in relationship with, sensing with the whole energy body, but then sensitive to one's own experiences as the one who is blessed, and one's own experiences of the energy body. And that includes whatever emotions, whatever soul resonances, etc., arise and pass within that. So for the one who's blessed, it's a task in sensitivity, in opening the energy body and the senses to that really full relationship with the one who is blessing, and then tracking, noticing what happens primarily in the energy body and the emotions as this person blesses you. So one wants to establish that, a really good energy body and emotional sensitivity and awareness. And then on top of that, when that's ready, probably that needs to be there before one then opens it up to including any sensing with soul or soul sense of the whole relational field there. The whole experience of being blessed, the other, the self, the moment, all of it. But practically speaking, or at least from the outside, so to speak, one is just silent and still and open, and the task is one of sensitivity, an energy body and the emotion, and then in the soul sense. So one is not responding. And then maybe after 10 minutes, well, you can time it yourself. 10 minutes might feel like a lot doing something like this. So it'll probably it may be that this is really quite difficult. That some people find it's really quite difficult. They're a bit sort of baffled or stumped what to do, how to do this at all. But hopefully it could also be fun. So a few variations to throw in, but let's say after about 10 minutes you can reverse roles, and maybe you need some silent meditation or something in between, perhaps to gather, maybe not. You'll have to see. 10 minutes, as I said, may feel very long, or it may be that it may feel very difficult and awkward, and one isn't quite sure, what to do and what sounds to make, etc. Or it may be that actually it needs 10 minutes, or it needs a little longer to get going, to get into a kind of groove, because it's unfamiliar. So for some people it may not be at all. But either way, even if it's difficult, hopefully it can be fun as well as lots to discover there as an exercise. So, if you're in the blessing role, then you can improvise your utterances. Improvise what comes through your mouth. Take your time. It may be very fast. There's a very fast flow or very slow flow. It may be there's pauses in between utterances or movements or gestures, or that it's just continuous streams, or maybe continuous stream then a pause or whatever. It may be loud or soft. See if you can let your sense of any soulfulness that's there, any sense of soul making, let that sense guide you. Just as we use that as a guide in imaginal practice, etc. And again, so you want to be feeling, sensing the energy body, the resonances in the soul and the energy body. You want to be putting, as you're blessing, your whole energy body in relationship with the other. It may be that you deliberately bring in or play with the deliberate introduction of an image of yourself, that you inhabit a certain image, perhaps that you're familiar with, or certainly that's arising at the time, or an image of the other, a sensing the soul of the other, or of the space you're in, or, as I said, of the movements and gestures and utterances themselves, that you bring in a deliberate images, a deliberate imaginal sense of what they are. It may be that there's an image that you bring in that's a third, so that this imaginal figure is somehow coming, or if you like, in touch with you, and through you they are blessing the other, but it's really coming from this. So there's all kinds of possibilities here. So for some people this is going to be really quite strange, and may take a little getting used to, may feel a little awkward. Others will just maybe not at all, and it's just easeful and delightful and fun. Then a few variations, okay? So one is the only rule is no words. You can make any movement or any gesture or any vocalization. So any movement, gesture or vocalization is okay, but not words. So no language. A second possibility is no words and also no vocalizations. So you can only use movement and gesture, no voice. Still, how you bless just through movement and gesture. What wants to come, what feels soulful there. Can I sense that, be in relationship and follow that thread? And a third possibility is no words, but no movements or gestures either, only vocalizations. Okay? So you've got movements, gestures, vocalizations, all okay. And then you've got only movement and gestures, okay. And then you've got only vocalizations, okay. So 3 variations. Sometimes it might occur to you to, sing a melody, if you're allowed to vocalize. And so that's fine. Maybe that's part of, you hum or sing something, that's part of the blessing. If you do that, make sure that sometimes you try it without singing a melody, without singing anything. Just to, again, we're interested in really opening up ranges here. Okay, now either the second part or a separate exercise, we could conceive of them either way. Like you could separate this exercise number 4 into 2 separate exercises and do them at different times, or you can kind of just segue one part into the next. But the second part, the second exercise, would be then the same thing, but dropping any idea of an attempt to express or convey some meaning. In other words, something that one could say in words. So even blessing may be something that one could, aspects of it could translate into words. But just, see, it's almost, maybe it's just a second part, you're taking it to another level really, dropping any idea of an attempt to express or convey any meaning. Something that could get put into words. Or an emotion. You're not conveying or expressing an emotion, or an image, or an event, or a story, or my story, or your story, or whatever it is. There's just movement, gesture, and voice. And dropping any sense of an attempt to express something with that, to convey something that means anything with that. So remember, we have the element of the imaginal, meaningfulness, and this also not reduced to a single meaning. So, what happens then if we recognize soul is more than this or that meaning? Even if the meanings are important, even if the meanings are important to soul, soul is more than that meaning, than any meaning. And soul is also more than heart. So what happens now? Perhaps then also the notion of blessing may get kind of altered or dropped. So does that make sense as an exercise? Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about that. And what happens in that second part, then we could say we've gone beyond blessing in the usual sense. Because it's an interesting word, blessing, and I think, it sort of occupies an area that's kind of at the edge of what could be put into other words. But in a way, in the second part of this exercise, we're just encouraging what we're doing through movement and gesture and voice to extend beyond the notion of blessing in the usual sense, because we're trying to drop any attempt at expressing or conveying any meaning or anything that could be put into words. Okay, I think that's it. So hopefully that's clear for that exercise. And I think we'll stop for today there. And add the fifth exercise at a different time. Okay, but hopefully that's enough to be going with, and that makes sense, and you can play with that. And as I said, it might feel very awkward, it might feel very, very strange for some people, and maybe not at all for others, everything in between. It might feel difficult, you might feel very self-conscious, all kinds of things. But it might also be fun. But wherever it starts, it can grow. And it might start, even it feels all very nice, and maybe you're used to it from different retreats that we've done to some extent. But then even from where it is there, it can grow and deepen and complexify and become a lot more subtle as well, and involve a lot more sensitivity. So both on the part of the one who blesses and the part of the one who is blessed. And as I say, maybe in the second part of this exercise we're even talking about something that's beyond the notion of blessing in the way that we usually use that word anyway. So there is just an exercise, or there is just a dyad using movement, gesture, voice with the purpose of the intention towards deepening sensitivity, extending range, and being receptive to soul. Receptive to soul and a vehicle for soul. A vehicle of soul. And all that sensitivity and that opening up of where we can sense soul and how soul can express through us and what we can recognize as soul. All that becomes the main point, and that has an extraordinary range of subtlety that's possible there, and sensitivity and growth and dimensionality. So that's really that's a big part, range and depth, sensitivity and including subtlety. Of course it doesn't have to be subtle only, but it can move into that territory more and more. So that's what this is for. That's the purpose of this. That's the invitation.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org/donate.